Welcome to another Chalkboard Minute with me, your teacher. Now, we're going to talk about just some basics first. That's cause and effect in water quality, okay? So we've got water quality, cause and effect. That's what that says, even though it's hard to see. Now, there's some things that I've already talked about that we'll kind of go over, and maybe it'll help you if you see it written out, maybe it'll help you take notes. So one of the things we've talked about a lot is turbidity. Which, as you may remember from the other video, is the opposite of clarity. Now let's talk about what that causes. So turbidity is essentially muddy water, right? It's just very, very muddy water. It's a high amount of dissolved or suspended solids in the water column. There's dirt molecules suspended between the water molecules, and it creates this muddy water. So first things first, that you can obviously see, like you saw in that other video when I created that cloud of muddy water, you can see that it has a shadow. So you can see on the film that it's blocking the light. And once it blocks the light, what happens from there, we get a decrease in photosynthesis, and as soon as we get a decrease in photosynthesis, we're going to get a decrease in oxygen. And that's going to be called DO, dissolved oxygen. Okay, so that's, pick that up and show you. All right, so we get blocks light. That decreases the photosynthesis of our submergent vegetation. That's the vegetation growing in the water, not above the water. So when it does photosynthesis, it gives the oxygen into the water. That's why that's important. Okay, and then we've got a decrease in dissolved oxygen because of the turbidity. Now, what else can happen? When dirty water warms up in the sun, just like, you know, you've walked on like hot ground in the summertime, it heats up, right? That says that the suspended dirt heats up in the sun, and then what does that cause? So now we get warmer water. The water's heating up because the stuff in the water is heating up. And then we get a similar or a compounding effect that those water molecules, because they're bouncing around all over the place, they won't hold oxygen molecules. So what happens is the warm water releases those oxygen, those O2 molecules, and now we get the same thing here, a decrease in oxygen. So specifically dissolved oxygen. So here's how we get it. Stuff in the water warms up, then the water warms up, then the molecules won't hold oxygen anymore. Then we get a decrease in dissolved oxygen. And at the same time, this upper effect is also happening. So the greater result is a complete or very severe loss of dissolved oxygen if you have chronic turbidity. Okay, now let's get into nitrogen and phosphorus and see what happens. So what's going to go in is nitrogen. We got nitrogen molecules, and that's probably from fertilizer or from feces. And phosphorus molecules. That's not elemental phosphorus. That's the difference between the phosphorus element and phosphorus molecules. This is phosphorus that's bound to a bunch of other things, usually hydrocarbons, like fats and oils and that sort of thing. But you learned that from biology, because you remember that. You remember everything from biology, right? Okay, so we got nitrogen and phosphorus runoff. That's going to lead to a couple of different things. Usually, these are already bound to hydrogen molecules, specifically hydrocarbons usually. But nitrogen is sometimes if it's like an industrial fertilizer, it'll be something like ammonium nitrate, that is just like a huge amount of nitrogen already broken down and ready to go. Otherwise, it might be something like proteins. If it's feces, it's going to be in uric acid, urea, and material that is not fully decomposed in the poop. And so it's already bound to hydrogen molecules anyway. So one of the immediate effects is H plus ions released, particularly if we're talking about this nitrogen and phosphorus coming from poop, from feces, or however you want to say that word, manure, nears, whatever. All those words mean poop. Okay, now, as you probably remember from chemistry, every time we have H plus ions in solution, that's an acid, okay? So pH is dropping, becoming more acidic. And eventually what we have is the entire ecosystem, the pH is too low. By too low, I mean that it is outside the zone of tolerance for most of the organisms in the ecosystem. Pretty sure tolerance has one L. And I'm going to say here the community. Okay, remember that community means all the populations. So this is the plant community and the animal community. The pH is too low for them both. And then you get what we saw in the Turtle Man video, where you don't have plants in the water, you don't have fish in the water, you don't have amphibians breeding in the water because they can't lay their eggs in a pH that low. All sorts of stuff. The ecosystem just starts to fall apart because you're losing organisms one at a time. Okay, so there we have it. That's not the end of the story though. So we come all the way back here, other than the pH thing. These are plant nutrients. So we're going to get a huge amount of plant growth. And algae growth. Now, you're probably thinking, well, these are producers. It's the bottom of the food chain. What's wrong with that? There is such a thing as too much of a good thing. So when you get all these plants and algae growing, and they're feeding off the nitrogen and phosphorus, what happens when they use up most of the nitrogen and phosphorus? Well, the extra plants and algae that have grown because of the extra carbon and phosphorus, or nitrogen and phosphorus, they die, okay? So what happens here is excess plants and algae die. Okay? This is sort of the beginning of the end. Okay? Now, when they die, then they start to decompose. Via bacteria. Now, why would I underline bacteria? Why is that important to this lesson at all? Okay, see, bacteria are not photosynthetic, so they don't create oxygen, they use oxygen, okay? So, as soon as this happens, they're gonna start using oxygen to live out their life cycle, and they're feeding off of these dead plants and algae. So they're going to use up all the oxygen in decomposition. Okay? Now we've got low oxygen and tons of bacteria. We got tons of bacteria going on here, tons of decomposition, low oxygen. Here's the other thing, is that when they do this decomposition, they release a lot of the same things that you release and the cows release and the chickens release and the pigs release and deer release and everything else is NH compounds, okay? The urea, uric acid, ammonia, ammonium, those sort of things, they're all NH compounds. So there's some combination of nitrogen and hydrogen, okay, and there's half a dozen different types that are going to be released here. But what you need to know is the nitrogen and hydrogen compounds released and when that happens, remember H plus ions get released. So it's kind of going off this way because I ran out of room. H plus ions released. And then the pH plummets. And it's going to drop below the zone of tolerance of a lot of the organisms. And so it goes back to where we were at with the low pH that we talked about a second ago. It drops below what these organisms can handle, and the ecosystem's falling apart. And this is all happening at the same time. So the nitrogen and phosphorus in two different processes that you saw here eventually lead to low pH. And in this process here, it leads to low oxygen, okay? Now, this is called, this bacterial process, this lower process you hear of this bacterial decomposition going on, it's called cultural eutrophication. So short. Cultural eutrophication, okay? So that's referring to bacterial cultures. So this whole process of we've got organic matter coming in, poop, pee, something like that, and then there's this whole plant growth, and then the plant growth all dies, and then there's this whole bacterial growth thing. That's cultural eutrophication. The chronically low oxygen that's created a couple of different ways here is called hypoxia. Stuff. Hypo meaning below, and oxia meaning oxygen. So this is our state of chronically low oxygen that's kind of coinciding with the cultural eutrophication and the whole process with bacteria. Okay, what I've got for you here is a graph that you're probably going to see in the book. You're probably going to see it on the internet. You're probably going to see it on the test. So let me explain what you're seeing here. The blue line is DO, which stands for dissolved oxygen. DO stands for dissolved oxygen, and that's O2 molecules that are suspended in the water. And that's what everything in the water breathes. Everything from eggs and, fish and all sorts of other little microorganisms and microfauna, we call them, all the little snails and bugs and larvae and all sort of other things in the water all breathe this dissolved oxygen. Okay, now BOD stands for biological oxygen demand. Now you can see why I didn't write it all out there, because it's a whole lot, but I'll put it on here. Biological oxygen demand. So that's the amount of oxygen that is needed for the community, okay? For the plant and animal community. Now remember, plants do use oxygen at night when they're not doing photosynthesis. Photosynthesis when they create oxygen in the presence of sunlight. But when the sun's down, they're not creating oxygen, they're using oxygen, okay? So there's a biological oxygen demand from plants. And of course, everything that lives in the water has all the animals, the fauna, that live in the water have a biological oxygen demand too, because they're all respiring, they're all breathing, okay? So what is supposed to happen is that the dissolved oxygen is up here, and it goes up and down. It goes up during the day when all the plants are making oxygen, and it drops down a little bit at night. It kind of fluctuates, okay? And biological oxygen demand can fluctuate too, okay? So as predator-prey relationships happen, as various fish harvests happen, as insects go from the larva stage and they hatch and they fly off and they're not even in the water anymore, and so then the biological oxygen demand goes down a little bit because they're not in the water anymore. It's stuff like that. So that fluctuates a little bit up and down, okay? But in general, the amount of dissolved oxygen should be well above the amount that is needed by the plant and animal community, the flora and fauna. Now, right here, we have some point source pollution. Point source pollution is pollution that you can point to the exact source. That pipe over there is releasing sewage from a trailer park right into this stream. And I've seen that. People do that. People with RVs, a lot of times will just pull over and run their chemical toilet, just drain their toilets right off into a creek. And because it flows down the creek and there's no evidence, there's no name on it, you don't know whose turd that is, And that kind of happens. So that's what we've got simulated here, is some point source water pollution that is nitrogen and phosphorus. So in this little diagram, it's from feces, okay? So there's going to be a slight bump, just a little bump in the oxygen produced when all those plants and algae respond instantaneously, right? And that's going to last for a little bit until they use it all up. Then what happens? They die, and the amount of oxygen being produced starts to really sink. And it go over all that stuff that we just talked about, all those cause and effects that cause the oxygen level to decrease. Well, here we go. Now we're on the train. Choo-choo, oxygen level going down. And biological oxygen demand goes up instantaneously, because we're talking about bacteria here. Bacteria reproduce, far faster than any other living thing can reproduce. Now you're going to say, well, what about viruses? Viruses aren't alive. So in the living world, in the world of cells, there's nothing that reproduces like bacteria, particularly bacteria in water, right? When they got everything that they need, they just explode, okay? So that's why our biological oxygen demand spikes. And this is our zone of decomposition. These plants are dying. pH, I don't have pH on here, but the pH would go from relatively neutral. Let's put pH on here. We're going to use white for pH. So if this was, like 14 and 0, below 7 is acidic, above 7 is basic. And most of our water bodies, let's put this at 7. Most of our aquatic ecosystems, okay? Remember, the ocean is actually supposed to be basic. But most of our aquatic, freshwater ecosystems actually run around a 6, something like that. So if it's going along, it gets here, you know, and as soon as these bacteria start decomposing and releasing all these hydrogen ions, then it's going to drop extremely, okay? And that pH, I've seen pHs as low as 4. I've even seen pH as low as 3. I've seen pHs so low in swamps that when you walk around in the swamp, like waist deep in the swamp, then it will dissolve your skin, it'll dissolve your toenails, it'll even dissolve your clothes. Your clothes are like thinner and threadbare after the water dries. The acid is so intense that it's actually decomposed your clothes. And I've seen that, been in it, it's nasty. Okay, so the pH is sinking here, oxygen level is dropping out the bottom. Now, if we get here, where we're outside the zone of tolerance of how low an oxygen level these animals can stand, we're going to get a huge die-off. And then, if that happens, then all the fish start to rot and decompose. And this problem just got a whole lot worse. If the oxygen gets low enough to kill all the fish, then there's a colossal issue. Killing the algae and plants, you know, it dying off because it used up the nitrogen and phosphorus, that's one thing. If the nitrogen and phosphorus pollution is bad enough that it's releasing its own hydrogen ions, okay, it's dropping the pH just being there. And then the bacterial decomposition is also dropping the pH. If the pH gets that low to where the acid will kill things, okay, the acid is so low, the oxygen level is so, or the pH is so low, the acidity is so bad. The pH is so low and the oxygen is so low that now it's going to kill off everything. Nothing can grow in it. And then this situation persists and persists and persists and becomes really, really bad. Now, things can heal itself, like streams in particular, because the pollution will flow downstream. And as it goes downstream, then the emergent plants, right, those things who's growing on the bank, but the roots are kind of down in the water and they're using that, they're going to start sucking up some of that nitrogen and phosphorus and starting to heal the situation, right? Now, it depends on how much and how pervasive and how long lasting this nitrogen and phosphorus runoff is. Determines how bad this problem gets, okay? And right here is we've got our cultural eutrophication, and this is our super low oxygen. We've got hypoxia, right? Now, if the point source pollution can be stopped or reduced significantly, then these bodies of water can heal themselves, particularly if the pH isn't that bad yet that stops the plant growth. And if the oxygen level is such that the plants can make it through the night, then the ecosystem will start to heal itself. If it gets below the zone of tolerance, either the pH or the oxygen, if it gets below the zone of tolerance of the animals and the plants, then that's it. You got a dead ecosystem.